What's up, guys? Welcome back to the shop. Today's video we're going to be making a feather pattern Damascus knife. Now, truth be told, I've never tried a feather pattern knife before. I've never actually cut a billet in half with, well, I have cut a billet in half, but not like in half like for a feather pattern. So this is going to be a first for me. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to alternate my 15 and 20 and 1084 and make my first billet. That way we can start with our first layers of Damascus. If I remember correctly, when I started this build, which this build was started a few weeks ago, at least a month and a half ago actually. And when I started this build, I didn't know what I was gonna do, and a partial of the way through it, I decided I was gonna go for a feather pattern Damascus. Now looking forward, I should have made some C's with this prior to doing my first restack, but I didn't, and that would have given me a nice pattern in the end. Overall, I'm still happy with what I got, but next time I do feather pattern Damascus, I'm definitely gonna put some C's in there. That way it gives more contrast to the actual feather. But here we're doing our just standard pressing and lengthening our billet. That way we can get it down to 1 inch by however width it had. I think I got it down to 1 inch by 2 inch roughly. And afterwards we're gonna cut it and stack it again. That way we can have a higher layer count. And to avoid a lot of the repetition, I just went on ahead and prepped this one again. So we're just gonna do the same thing. We're gonna press it down and lengthen it back so we can do our next press. Originally we started with 16 layers, so here we're stacking it by 4 again. So it's going to be 4 by 16, which is approximately, let me get my calculator, that way I don't get bullied again for doing my math wrong. And it is a very healthy 64 layers. So we're going to stretch this out to the same thickness, 1 inch by 2 inch, so we can cut it up and restack it again. And while this is pressing, let me announce to you guys that I did do the Apocalypse challenge in yesterday's video. If you haven't checked that out, be sure to check it out. It was yesterday's video. And also while you're there, check out the other contestants' videos. Everybody made some really cool projects, so be sure to check them out and vote for who your favorite is, which hopefully it's going to be me. But if it's not, I understand. There were some very cool builds. I think one of my favorites was definitely a small scythe. That thing was pretty cool. And that one was made by Eric from the Rivers Experience, if I'm not mistaken. But if you didn't know about that, that is definitely going on, and I recommend you guys go check it out. So here I'm just going to continue working it down with my drawing dies. This time I'm working it down to about a 1/2 inch. Those are my 1/2 inch kiss blocks. And it seems like I welded a different piece of Damascus to this one for my holding stick. That's why it looks like that. And the reason why I am actually forging it down to the side is because I have some 1084 that I'm going to add to it, and I want to forge it down to be thinner so it'll match the 1084 thickness. Alright guys, so I have my new billet here. I decided to add some extra 1084, and I put one in between all the pieces like so. And I left this one on top because once I forge this down, I'm actually going to stack it. So I'm going to make sure that I have this one to continue the pattern back and forth, you know, one on, one off. So this should give it a nice bold black line in between the Damascus patterns. Hopefully it looks good. I'm hoping it does. So now we're moving to press number 3, and for press number 3 we stacked it again 4 times, and we added 4 more pieces to the billets for the overall layer count. Is going to be 4 times 56, which is 256, plus 4 more pieces that we added, so that's gonna be a grand total of 260 layers at this point. Man, it's starting to feel like math class up in this forge. So now it's time for our final press, and I actually had troubles getting this billet into the forge because it's so tall. It was very awkward to fit in there. But now we are at over 1,000 layers, which is approximately 1,040 layers if I'm not mistaken. And now we're gonna square up our billet so we can cut it with our cutting die. So I had originally made, well, I was gonna make a thinner die to cut it with because I thought I was just needed to cut it. But I was watching an Instagram reel of Kyle Royer's father, and he was making a feathered Damascus at the same time as I was working on this, and I saw he had more like an axe shape to his, so I ended up buying a wedge from Harbor Freight, and I cut a piece off that wedge and I just welded it onto my piece. I could have forged my own, but I was at Harbor Freight and this thing was like 10 bucks, so I just bought it and cut it, and I used the other piece for something else. So I ended up getting 2 different parts from this one $10 piece, which is a deal if I do say so myself. Now I had a lot of issues with cutting this, and it ended up getting stuck, so I'm gonna have to make a jig that holds it down while it pulls it back up. That way I don't have that issue anymore. But after a lot of headaches, I finally was able to cut it all down and split it down the center, and I got a pretty good separation. So here are the 2 pieces, and now I gotta grind them nice and clean so I can re-weld them together. And normally I would just grind it clean on the inside, but while I was grinding it I realized that it was better just to grind it completely flat instead of trying to save some kind of material. It was better to just grind them completely flat. That way whenever I welded them back together they were making very good contact. That way I could ensure a nice solid weld without too many air gaps in between, and I got a pretty good weld because of that. And this time, to just make it easier, I put a very long holding stick on it, and it worked like a charm to be able to manipulate it and press it properly. And so here is our final forge weld, and we're just gently pressing from top to bottom. Because this was my first time doing it and I didn't really have any specific, way of doing it or any kinds of jigs, or my eyes are crooked and I wear glasses, I ended up cutting it a little bit angled, so I have one feather or one side of the feather that's actually a little bit wider than the other, so that's gonna come out in the final pattern. But overall I think it came out pretty nice. I just have to find a way to tweak that way I can cut them straighter next time. Not sure if it was just because I was holding it incorrectly, or maybe my cutting die was a little bit at an angle. I'm not sure. That's something I'm gonna have to figure out as I go. And one more thing, looking back, I'm such a genius that I ended up cutting this standing instead of just laying it flat, and I would have actually had a better cut if I had laid it flat. So I have my 2 billets here. They're pretty thick, but my bandsaw did a not so great job cutting it. So I'm gonna end up putting it back in the forge and just squeezing with the press, get a nice consistent squeeze. That way I can go on ahead and put it into the surface grinder and clean off all the extra excess that I have on there, get all these cracks out, and hopefully end up with a nice clean piece of steel that I can then use for a knife that won't, start chipping away. All these cracks are very surface level, with the exception probably like this one or something, but I can just grind in there. But the steel is pretty clean, so I have high hopes about that. Both came out very clean. So we're gonna do that. So I know some of you may ask yourselves, why am I flattening it prior to grinding it? Why don't I just go on ahead and forge it? But the reason why I decided not to forge it and instead grind it nice and clean prior is because feather pattern is made from so many pieces and they're pressed in such an awkward fashion with its stresses and all kinds of angles that if I decided to press it and forge it out from that point forward instead of going in and grinding all those parts out, I would have had a lot of delaminations. I would have had minor cracks that were in there that from the extra stresses of forging it with the hammer and manipulating it in different directions, it would have started splitting. And I did have some small areas that did try to split on me, but fortunately they weren't too big of an issue and they weren't too deep in the actual billet. So this really helped out. So if you're ever going to do feather Damascus yourself, you're going to try it at home if you're a maker, definitely make sure you take your time and you clean up all those pieces and you grind out all those little hairline fractures, because those little cracks will open up and be bigger cracks. And trust me when I say a little bit of extra cleaning and a little bit of extra prep goes a long way, especially when you put in so many hours and so many different forging sessions into one piece of steel. It makes all the difference. So after getting my general shape done with my hydraulic press, because I'm a lazy forger, now I go into fine tuning with my hammer. All I'm doing here is I'm trying to get the shape consistently how I want it, making sure it's not too thick, and I'm trying to forge distal taper into this, which was a mistake that I end up grinding out anyways whenever I end up flattening it. So I don't know why I did that, but it's just a force of habit, and I'm trying to get as much length as I can out of this knife. I do like my heels on my knives to be around 1 3/4 to 2 inches, and so I always try to get that kind of heel on my knives whenever I can, but afterwards I worry about the length. This knife ended up being about 7 inches, which was something I was happy with. I was going for an 8-inch knife, but sometimes it just, my math doesn't math up whenever I'm dividing my portions for my handle and for the rest of the blade. And on knives like this, you don't want to forge too thin unless you're just a better forger than I am, but I personally don't like to forge too thin, because then I end up having a lot of decarb and issues in certain areas where I can't grind out all the little divots without, going too thin on the actual knife, which I have run into that issue before on other knives. Let's say I'm doing a high-end, high layer count, just random Damascus, and I'll have a little pit spot there that is always going to be white shadowed because it has lower carbon content there because it was a little pit. So to avoid that, you always want to leave your knives a little bit thicker. If it was just a brute to forge a knife, I understand. You gotta forge it a lot thinner, but for something like this, it's better just to have more material and remove it than to not have enough. So now with all the forging done, we're moving on to our knife. Here I'm putting in some ferric chloride, that way I can see where the pattern is. Because I have the line going forward towards a point, I put in the acid to see where that center line is. That way I can match my point to that center line and base my whole knife off of that. That way the center knife, or the stem of the, what would it be called? I'm not sure if it's called a stem, but the center part, the center ridge of the feather is going to hit towards the tip of the knife, or as close as I can get it without the knife being too far off and too, weird looking. Which fortunately it was pretty centered, but I did end up having to lose about a little bit over 1 inch on the tip. Actually, it was less, it was about 3/4 off the tip of the knife, which made me end up with a smaller knife than I had originally anticipated. But for the sake of aesthetic, it was definitely a sacrifice that had to be done. Alright guys, so got the knife shaped up. I decided to do the feather this way to see what the pattern would look like. I know traditionally it goes the other way, but I wanted to see what it looked like this way. So it looks pretty interesting. And I made sure that to get the tip of the feather as close to the tip as I could. So that's why I ended up taking off so much material, which sadly makes it a little bit shorter. It's a little bit over 6 inches now. It was a little bit over 7 inches, but oh well, it's the price we pay for symmetry, I guess. Overall, it's looking pretty good, pretty promising. 2-inch heel, small stout little knife. So next up, I'm gonna do my pinholes, and we're gonna heat treat. Overall, I think it's coming out pretty nice. And I still have this guy over here. It's getting a little rusted, but this is the other half of the leaf, and it's a lot thicker. So I'll have a lot more material to do my other knife with. And I'm gonna do this one the other way. So this one was forged with the billet this way, and this gamma forged with the billet this way. And we'll compare to see what they look like side by side. Hopefully I get to this soon. If not, this knife might be gone by then. But regardless, we have pictures, and that one matters. So, yep, let's get on to our pinholes. And for anybody that doesn't like my commentary and feels that I've been yapping too much on this video, I actually started a new channel that is called JP's Bladeworks ASMR. I chose ASMR because I didn't know what to call it, and ASMR is basically just sounds or something like that. So if you like those kinds of videos where it's just machine sounds, I highly encourage you to go check that out and go subscribe. Or if you just like my work and you want to help support me in any way, definitely go check out that channel and subscribe and watch a couple videos. I would greatly appreciate that. Alright guys, so we are out of the temper and this thing is looking great. It came out nice and solid, and that feather is looking pretty cool. And I'm pretty happy with this guy so far. I have very high hopes. So I'm going to put it on the surface grinder, and I'm going to get rid of all this scale and whatever. It's not much scale. And then we're going to go on ahead and do our finished grind. So far, so good. The final grind on this knife went pretty quickly since my knife was already pretty thin. I'm not sure exactly what thickness it was. I never measured, but it was definitely slightly under 1/8 thick all the way throughout the knife. So it is a very light knife, and it's a very sharp knife because it's so thin. But with such thinness comes the issue of overheating, so it's important to keep cooling it down as I'm working it, especially with older belts. If I use newer belts, it heats up just slightly less. And with a little bit of work, I got it ground roughly to where I wanted it, and it was time for hand sand. Now the hand sand sucked, and that's basically all I gotta say about it. Hand sanding sucks. And now we're moving on to our handle. The handle material I'm using here I bought from a Pop's Knife Supply. It is a stabilized type of wood. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I am like 99.9% sure it was a maple burl of some kind. I believe it was actually a curly maple block, actually, because I do have some waviness in the final pattern, so it was more of a curly maple than a maple burl. And to help achieve my full etch, I'm gonna put these little G10 spacers in between these liners, and that's gonna help me do that. So originally I was gonna drill all the way through, but then I decided to do hidden pins because I couldn't find the pins that I actually wanted to use. But then I found them, so I ended up drilling all the way through. And that's why pretty much whenever I was pressing, I was just slightly tapping it, versus right here where you can see all the holes are through and the pins are sticking out. When I do black liners, I like to match it up with some black pins whenever I can, because it just looks cool and it actually looks like it belongs there, and it gives it that extra little aesthetic touch. A lot of people don't like the dyed handle material. I like it. I do need to order some more raw or stabilized but naturally stabilized woods. That way they look, you know, they have those hues of the natural wood color. But I do also enjoy these dyed wood blocks as well. I think they look very pretty. And from here we're moving on to our glue up. The glue up is pretty standard. I'm using my G-Flex epoxy. Ever since I started using it, I've had no issues, so I definitely recommend it. If you don't have it, definitely try it. I'm gonna see if I can find an Amazon affiliate link to it if you want to buy it, or you can click any of my links in my description, any of my Amazon links, and then you can just, search up G-Flex epoxy and you can find it on there, and I will get a small kickback. By the way, my drilling press finally did bite the dust while I was drilling these holes, so if you want to help support the channel, that's definitely one way to do it. If not, as I said, I did start that new channel. It will be in the description down below. Check it out. Go subscribe. I am trying to get that channel monetized as soon as possible, so I need to hit the 1,000 subscriber threshold and the 4,000 hours. I'm pretty close on the hours already, a weekend, so I'm not too worried about that. But getting the subscribers has always been a pretty slow thing on my channel. So if you want to help support by going and subscribing and helping me get those watch hours, I would really appreciate it. And all that extra money that comes out of there is going to go to buying new tools in the shop, because I definitely need them. Now, enough self-promoting. We're going to move on to our handle, which is just going to be to grind up to our steel and go on ahead and contour the knife. One thing I really like about this material is that it's actually really soft. The 80 grit belt does quick work of it. Only a quick warning, if you're not used to working with these kinds of materials, the dust is very toxic, so I definitely recommend wearing a respirator. Regardless, you should always be wearing a respirator when you're grinding, but sometimes you're like, oh, it's just wood, I smell it all the time whenever I'm cutting stuff. This isn't normal wood. It has a resin in it that makes it stabilize, so you definitely want to not breathe that in because it's very toxic. Just an FYI for anybody that's new and has never done that before. It's pretty toxic. Here I do something funny. I measured the knife prior to put it in there, but I did it without a handle. So when I put the handle on, I couldn't get it to really fit, so I had to prop it up at an angle and then fill it up with water. And before I propped it up at an angle, as you could see, I made a mess everywhere and I spilled all over the floor. But we managed to get through it, and I left it propped up, and I made my coffee, and we did our coffee etch, which was a very successful coffee etch, so I'm very happy about that. The coffee etch did take a little bit longer than usual. Normally it's done within like 2 hours. This one took about 2.5, maybe 3-ish hours. But it definitely gave it a nice dark contrast, and I'm very happy with the design. Moving forward, I will be doing it with some crushed W's or some C's. That way it looks a lot better. Right now it's just straight lines with a little bit of a wave to it. But with those C's, I've seen them before, man, those things look sick. And they give it a whole different kind of depth to the actual Damascus pattern. But overall, the handle material is beautiful, and the material on the knife is great. I know I did it backwards, as some would say. Normally all the feathers have the pattern going the other way, but I want to do it this way because it was the smaller billet of the two, and I just wanted to see what it looked like. So I always like having fun and experimenting with my materials. Unfortunately, I finished this knife too late into the night, so I was able to take pictures prior to this upload. So I will be doing a post later on tomorrow or the day after, whenever I have a chance. I'll take some better pictures and post them on the YouTube, in a YouTube post, and on my Instagram. As always, guys, thank you very much for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.